Rich white Amazon, rich white Amazon, rich white Amazon, rich white Amazon. 700 yeses, 1800 no's. Jeff Bezos is laughing as to the bank he goes. Rich white Amazon, rich white Amazon, rich white Amazon, rich white Amazon. They listen to the bosses, they believe the lies. They thought they were protected, no need to organize. Rich white Amazon, rich white Amazon. Rich white Amazon.
Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to our first Friday event for this month. We have an exciting panel of activists and speakers, and that bring a great depth and breadth of knowledge about modern labor issues. This is a continuation, I think, of the thread we've been working on. We did a first Friday on Amazon in our backyard. This is a continuation of that thread and some other threads about the issues facing the modern labor movement. And so we're kind of building a tapestry here on our first Fridays of, issues that are affecting labor, but also the people that are involved, on the ground and nationally and internationally fighting for in the struggle. And I'd like to thank all the members of the education committee that really kind of dug into their contact list and really have got a whole bunch of great speakers together from throughout the nation to speak on not just this topic, but all the topics that we've been tackling. And so I'd like to thank our co-chairs, Donna Goodman and Beth Wilson, members Ashwini Sukhankar, Richard Burton, the one and only Sandy Oxford, our director, for putting this all together and making it look so easy. So thank you. Enjoy.
Thank you, Sparrow. And welcome to the May 2021 First Fridays panel discussion. My name is Donna Goodman, and I'm a member and statewide delegate of United University Professions, UUP, at SUNY New Paltz. Our opening song was sent to us by our sister Pat Lamana, social justice folk singer from Dutchess County, who never misses a chance to support labor. And thank you, Pat. This is the first anniversary of our First Friday series. We began on May Day of 2020. We were prepared to hold a public town hall discussion in person, and then everything shut down. But we rallied, we found Zoom, and we met all of you. So welcome and keep on joining us. It's been a significant year for labor. In the midst of gross attacks on labor by capital, in the midst of a decades-long decline in the power of labor, we're seeing real fight back and solidarity. The movement for Black Lives, the environmental movement, workers, both organized and unorganized, are finding ways to form coalitions and build power. Every one of these movements, separately and together, has been hit hard by the pandemic, and the lessons of solidarity in the face of greed and austerity and the resulting economic social inequality are being learned and passed on every day. This evening, we'll take a look at the current movement through the lens of two major events: the unionization campaign that the RWDSU just conducted at the Amazon warehouse in Bessemer, Alabama, and which Amazon won for now, and the struggle over the PRO Act, Protecting the Right to Organize Act, which has passed the House and must pass the Senate. We'll take a look at the long history of union busting in this country, legal, legislated union busting, and show how workers and the labor movement have fought back using the strategies of organizing, mass mobilizations, strikes, and legislation. As we listen to our speakers, let's think about what we can learn from the Amazon campaign here in the Hudson Valley, where, as we know, Amazon has broken ground. Let's not forget that it takes multiple times to win. This struggle has begun and it won't stop now. Panelists will discuss the history of labor law and current practices used by management to undermine the success of workers seeking to establish a collective voice in the workplace, including accounts of Amazon's tactics in the Bessemer election. We'll also discuss how the PRO Act would begin to level a playing field that is unfairly tilted toward big business and management, making union organizing drives and elections unreasonably difficult. Winning it will lead to a higher density of union membership, and it will help pave the way for workers to demand more, organize even better, and struggle for long-term worker power. We'll hear from 4 panelists and then open up for a discussion moderated by Beth Wilson. You can use the chat link on your Zoom screen to enter your questions or comments. So Samir Santi will start us off with an overview of the American labor movement and the great challenges workers have faced from our history of union busting. An expert on labor and working class history, Samir is an assistant professor of urban studies at the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies, the SLU, where he's a member of the CUNY Faculty Union, the Professional Staff Congress. He has worked as a political organizer for the Pennsylvania Association of Staff Nurses and Allied Professionals, and as a researcher for Unite Here, the union representing hospitality workers in the US and Canada. Prior to arriving at the SLU, Samir served as a special advisor on the presidential campaign of Senator Bernie Sanders. Since 2019, he has been the books and arts editor of SLU's New Labor Forum. Samir.
Thanks, Donna, for the introduction, and thanks everyone for having me here. I'm really thrilled to be speaking. I'm just really looking forward to this discussion at the Hudson area or Hudson Valley Labor Federation. I spent a lot of time in university circles, so it's always nice to be among our sisters and brothers in the labor movement itself. So I'll be quick. I was asked to talk, just kind of provide a little bit of context, historical context for the discussion today to set the stage. And I think we're going to hear much more detail and interesting contemporary stuff from our sisters and brothers who are involved both in Bessemer, who were involved in Bessemer, and who were involved in the fight for the PRO Act. But I guess just to step back a little bit and try to understand how we got to where we are. So I think as all of us know, all of us who've spent years in the movement know, we've been under attack for a long time. At this point, what is it, 10% of the US workforce is unionized. Within the private sector, that's something like 6%. And this is a precipitous decline from where we once were. In the mid-20th century, a third of the workforce was unionized. And I think that's sort of, a tough thing to even comprehend at this point. It's not just the numerical scale, right? 5-6 times as many workers proportionally were unionized, but what that meant in terms of class power in our society, it was a different time. Now, of course, not everything was great back then, but there was a real organized working class in the United States that influenced everything from politics at the national level to daily culture and life. So, how do we get from there to here? Like, what has happened? The first start, we could take this as far back as we want. The history of workers organizing, workers struggling, class struggle is as old as the history of capitalism, right? From the earliest days of capitalist development, working people have been exploited, have borne the brunt of employers' profiteering, and have resisted and organized in innovative and creative ways. So, we could spend, days, weeks talking about all that, but to kind of focus in on the immediate past, how we got to where we are. The story, I think, starts in the 1930s, right? One of the last great crises and great moments of upheaval of working class struggle. And so, again, some of this, I assume, a lot of folks are familiar with this, or at least have experienced the legacies of this in their own work, in their unions and in their workplaces. But the first place to start is in 1935, at the depth of the Great Depression, the passage of the National Labor Relations Act, which we still have today, right? We still deal with the NLRB, and we'll hear from folks at the RWDSU who dealt very, closely with the NLRB very recently, right? This is and has for the last 80 years been our labor law in the private sector. That's where we start. And I think a question that is often debated, always debated within the movement, within progressive circles, within the left, we might say, is what matters. How do we build a labor movement? What does it take to build a labor movement? Is it organizing, deep, purposeful organizing, ear to the ground, worker organizing, or is it politics and the law and the climate within which we're organizing? And this is a debate, right? It's always been a debate. And I think the answer is that it's both, right? It's always been both. There's no one answer. We could have the greatest law in the world. We could pass the PRO Act tomorrow, and we'll talk about the obstacles of passing the PRO Act tomorrow. But we could pass the PRO Act tomorrow, and if we don't organize, right, if we don't take seriously the task of organizing, of building committee, of preparing, our sisters and brothers at work for the fights that are going to come in spite of the law, we're not going to win. Right? There's no shortcut, as Jane McAlevey said, to that kind. Jane McAlevey, who's just been writing a lot about labor. There's no shortcut, is the sort of expression that she uses for building the kind of working class power that we need. With that said, organizing is really hard, as we all know, and it's extremely hard in our current climate, where the law is stacked against us, where employer power is overwhelming. And so when we look historically, what was it that led to the great surges when our predecessors made the advances that have laid the foundation for our movement today? In the 30s, the National Labor Relations Act was passed. This is not passed out of nowhere. There's mass upheavals, right? In 1934, there were general strikes in Toledo, Ohio, in Minneapolis, in San Francisco, right? Massive struggles. And those are just sort of the famous big ones. All over the country, there was struggle happening. And this struggle starts to push the hand of those in power. And one response, and we might still to this day, John Lewis, who was the founding president of the CIO, called it the Magna Carta of the working class, right? The National Labor Relations Act is passed in 1935. And in the years after the Wagner Act or the NLRA is passed, we see an explosion in union membership. I mean, organizers couldn't handle the number of calls or of let's say, letters they were receiving at the time by workers wanting to organize. And it grew and grew and grew. And through World War II, we see expansions, doubling, tripling of the size of the labor movement. And this persists until soon after World War II, at which point there's a managerial offensive against us. And this is something that we always have to be prepared for, right? When we start organizing, when we start building power, the employers dig in their heels and fight back even harder. And in 1947, right, this is 2 years after the end of World War II, they got their first big win with the Taft-Hartley Act, right? Which again, many of us have heard about, have dealt with. Those of us who've organized in places like Alabama have dealt with the consequences of it, right? Of right to work laws and a bunch of other, employer free speech measures that enable them to do all kinds of nasty things, hold captive audience meetings, intimidate workers, and so on. And that's their first big win. And in the years right after that, right after 1947, we see private sector union membership plateau. After levels around our current levels in the early 1930s and 1920s, 5-6%, we reached 33%, and then that's where we stopped. That was the ceiling that we hit. And ever since, private sector union membership has been in steady decline. Now, the second big moment that's often overlooked, and I assume I myself and many of us here are a part of this and a product of this, was a great surge of public sector unionizing in the 1960s. And the public sector is, if nothing else, political. And here again, we see the role of politics and the law together with rank and file organizing and struggle coming together and leading to great waves of organizing. And that legacy, right, from in the 60s of public sector unionization is to this day really the foundation of our movement. Today, something like 70% of union members are either public employees directly employed by city, state, or the federal government, many of them teachers, or are in industries that are highly subsidized by public money or highly regulated, like healthcare, like utilities, like transportation, right? 70% of our movement is in the public sector or in public adjacent sectors. And that is, not for nothing. There's a reason behind that. And the reason is that we're able to influence the politics of public sector organizing in a different kind of way. Now, of course, not without significant setbacks along the way, as we saw in Wisconsin a decade ago, and as we experienced with Janus a few years ago. But as we've seen in climates where we have political power, we can continue to organize and maintain our membership. Places like New York, like California, like Illinois. What happened? Why did private sector density drop as fast as it did and as sharply as it did? It starts to slow in the 50s, right? It starts to slow pretty early. And some of this has to do with changes to US capitalism, right? Deindustrialization starts to happen. Automation, manufacturing, employment starts to decline in core industrial areas of the United States. But that doesn't account for the plummet, right? That accounts for the slowing, that accounts for some amount of decline. But the real drop starts around 1980. And what happened in 1980? Well, Ronald Reagan was elected president, and Ronald Reagan and the corporate class, which he represented, began a war on the working class. I mean, there's that, and that's not a exaggeration, or that's not hyperbole to put it that way, right? This was a purposeful, intentional war on working people that was reached its victory in 1980. Been planned, they've tried, they'd always been trying, but that's when they reached their victory. Of course, the infamous defeat of the air traffic controller strike in 1982 is a very important part of this story. Ronald Reagan fires thousands of air traffic controllers who are on strike, fighting for better working conditions to ensure that planes can fly safely, and that sends a signal to the rest of the corporate class that it's a free zone to attack workers. And in the 80s and in the 90s, we see intensifying offensives from the corporate class, as well as a gutting of the National Labor Relations Act. We still have this law on the books, right? The statute that was passed in 1935 is still on the books. But as we know, as any of us who've been a part of a grievance procedure or who've been a part of an organizing campaign and dealt with ULPs, the National Labor Relations Board adjudicates things all the time. And the precedents that they arrived at through the 1980s, through the 1990s, through the aughts, past decade, have systematically gutted the content of labor law to the point where it's no longer fair to call the NLRA a labor law. Really, it's an employer law at this point. That's what it is, right? It's a law that enables employers to go on the offensive against us. So what is to be done? We're going to hear a lot more about that, but it's two things. It's to continue to organize, right? And there's been great organizing over the last, there's always great organizing. And much of the organizing that I've been a part of is outside of the NLRB, right? Trying to figure out how we can build the union outside of the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board, because we know how much of an obstacle that is. But that's hard. Right, and it takes a lot of resources, and we can't scale up to the size that we need to be through such outside tactics. We need to change the political and legal climate within which we're organizing, and that's where the other side of this comes: reforming labor law, updating labor law through the PRO Act. So these two pieces are indispensable, right? Both of them are essential, and we right now, for the first time, certainly in my lifetime, in basically everyone's lifetime who wasn't around in 1935, we've got a shot to do it. So I'm really thrilled to be a part of this, and it's going to take, those of us here today continuing to fight in order to get it done. So I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thanks again for having me.
Thanks so much, Samir. Next, we'll hear from Adam Obernauer. He's the Director of Retail Organizing at RWDSU, the Retail, Wholesale, and Department Store Union, and helped run the Bessemer, Alabama Amazon organizing campaign. Just before the Amazon campaign, Adam led the organizing efforts at Housing Works, a large nonprofit organization in New York City, which was the largest union election victory in New York State in 2020. Adam, please walk us through the Amazon campaign. What happened? How do you assess the campaign, and how should we assess the campaign? What are the next steps? And also, how does the Amazon campaign fit in with the history in the South of civil rights and labor rights struggles?
Thanks, Donna. That's a lot to cover. I'll do my best. Yeah, so thanks everybody. Thanks for having me here. There's a lot I could talk about, but I'll try to contextualize and put it into as quick of a presentation as I can. And Samir, thanks for setting the stage, because I think it's a good segue into this campaign, right? So yeah, I'll start by saying how the campaign unfolded. So to walk through why some of the laws are so egregious, and to Samir's point, many unions have decided not to use the NLRA anymore and not to go through and file elections at the NLRB. Many of the largest campaigns at our union were run through corporate campaign style and worker minority unionism, which is like running petitions and taking direct action on the shop floor and compiled with a corporate campaign style attack at the employer on this like large level, to which you then try to get the employer to actually come to the table, right? Because of how bad the laws are. And now I'll go through like why the laws are so bad. So Amazon workers had come to us to organize in Alabama. We organize a lot of food manufacturing and processing in Alabama, and we're among having fights in the food manufacturing industry in the public realm during the pandemic. And so we had workers from Amazon come to the union hall to organize, and we started organizing with them. And there was a lot of issues, right? And this is a facility that opened in March, and workers reached out to us that summer to organize. So in a few months, we're so agitated based on the working conditions that they wanted to figure out how they make it better. And we're very scared about COVID and everything. At the time, there were about 2,300 workers, right, at the fulfillment center. That was our estimate. We said between 2,000, maybe 2,500. And then when we started counting, we got to about 2,300. Publicly, Amazon had stated that they had 1,500 workers and that they got tax credits for 1,500, and that's how many jobs they were creating. So as we were building a committee, we got to the stage where we wanted to file for an election. We filed with the intention of having Amazon. We knew they were going to flood the unit, so we filed with the number of 1,500 workers as our stated understanding of the unit, knowing it was a bit more than that. And what we didn't anticipate, we call it flooding the unit in the labor movement, but Amazon hired, just to contextualize, because there's a lot that's gone around about, well, how did the union not know there was 6,000 workers? There weren't. So that's how we didn't know. They hired 3,300 workers, give or take, in about a month and a half. When we did the pre-hearing with the NLRB, which is the hearing that sets the stage for how the election would be conducted, we had thousands of cards we didn't submit. And when we got to the hearing, we submitted those cards because of the numbers that Amazon was hiring. The hiring events were massive, and they then hired enough workers to triple the amount of workers that they originally had hired intentionally, so that we wouldn't meet the 30% threshold. The reason for withholding some of the cards until we got to the stage of the board was to take them by surprise and get them to an election. And so we did that. We did get to an election at Amazon. They were actually floored and surprised by the fact that we did, and didn't have a response to the board that then concluded the hearing and stipulated to an election date. And so I would say that the idea that you can hire 3,000 workers in a month and a half was a huge deal. At the hearing, we questioned that, and their lawyer, Harry Johnson, who actually worked during the Bush era at the NLRB and is a very high-profile union-busting lawyer for Morgan Lewis, the union-busting law firm, he said to the labor board that it was the largest hiring event in the history of the United States in the shortest period of time. And so they almost like laughed at how they can just drop as many workers as they want into a unit to flood it to crush a union effort. And so I'll then just explain some of the most egregious things Amazon did. we always prepare workers for anti-union campaigns, and they were prepared for this one. But I want to walk through what I like to call psychological warfare, is what workers are put through during a union busting campaign. And here, there's been a lot of talk about this mailbox, and I just want to talk about what that is. So the Amazon requested for a mail ballot for them to have a mailbox at work that workers could drop their ballots off to vote in. The labor board during the pre-hearing denied that because they said that would be considered surveillance. There's a lot that can happen if you have a mail ballot box on site. And so we're not going to accept that request. Amazon then went to the Postal Service and demanded that they set up a post office box on site. And there's a lot to be said about that. You usually can't get one within 6 to 8 weeks, but they demanded, as a big high profile customer of the Postal Service, that they should get preferential treatment and get a Postal Service box installed immediately. And so they did, because they have that much power. And what this did then was, for us as organizers telling workers, there's no way that you'd be able to bring your ballot to work to vote. It's been denied by the labor board. They had managers telling workers, bring your ballot to work. It's no problem. Bring it to work. If you want, ask a manager where you should vote and they'll direct it to you, giving the impression that Amazon was running the election, right? And so when that happened, we kept telling workers that there's no way that's possible. I mean, they could do it, but it would break federal labor law. And then they did it anyway. And so many workers called us and said, how come this box is here? I thought this was illegal. I don't feel comfortable, voting at this ballot box, to which was not a USPS official box. It was a cluster box, right? Which is what is installed in apartment buildings. And the question is if Amazon had the keys and everything else. And so what happens to the psychology of the worker in that moment is, if Amazon breaks this law openly, right, and we believe, and they were told they couldn't, is this the same law that they would break if they fired one of us, right? Is this the same labor law they would break if they interrogated us or surveilled us? And then when the answer is yes, the workers have a psychological understanding that the labor laws are not strong. And so I like to center everything around the ballot box, but also to say what else Amazon did. They surveilled workers, obviously. They had managers going around with clipboards asking if you supported the union or not. They would ask you if you're voting for the union just directly. All of these things are illegal, but what's the repercussion? There are none. And that's why they did it, right? I think Amazon made a calculation early on. They do everything to bust the union because they deal with the ramifications of labor law later. And that's what they did here. And so I like to say when union busters are hired, there's a certain package that the employer buys, and Amazon bought what would be like the platinum package, right? And they probably also said, we're not that concerned about laws being followed, right? And so that's what it was. We just want to break workers down so much that they lose this election. That's what we want the result of this to be. They changed the traffic lights so that workers couldn't meet with organizers, which was fine. I mean, we also had meetings with workers all the time. That wasn't super relevant, but just showed the power that they had. In addition, they had police parole the parking lot every 24 hours a day. 2 to 3 cop cars would parole the parking lot. And they had police also inside the fulfillment center, one of which they arrested a worker for not having a badge scan that got visibly upset with their management. And so what it showed too was that these were off-duty cops that were hired by Amazon that were in police uniform and using squad cars, even though they were not on duty. And so it created the perception to workers that the entire state was against them. Not only was the mailbox changed, not only did the Postal Service install the box, not only are the police walking around, but everything seems to be that Amazon doesn't need to follow the law, right? They're bigger than the law as a big part of I would say, what workers are feeling. And so overall, since the law is so weak, and I could go on and on about the meetings, captive audience meetings, which are legal, but they had 8 to 10 of them. Per worker, right? Every single day they had captive audience meetings going on. And the contradictions and the irony here is that once you walk away from your station at Amazon, your clock starts. It's called time off task. And immediately you can get written up if you're walking off your station, not on break. That's when you hear about the bathroom breaks, workers have to choose between going to the bathroom, how long it will take, and see if it will negatively impact their time. and you receive a write-up via your phone app. It's like a notification. No one actually from management talks to you about a write-up. So all of these things, I mean, I could talk forever about this, but the future of work, the surveillance, the data that Amazon collects, the mailbox outside, there's a camera outside, right in front of, like, by the mailbox, surveilling workers. And so the laws don't matter. They don't mean anything to Amazon. The remedy to all of this is a rerun election. It's just another election, right? And so thinking about how to organize Amazon is something the labor movement has to tackle. How do you do it? We don't have the answers to yet, right? But we do know that in Bessemer, there were 1,000+ workers that stood by and voted for the union. I don't even have time to talk about the legal challenges that they did on the mailbox and the ballots, and how they actually structured this with the challenge ballots in a way that suppressed workers' votes. The challenge ballots and how they did it, it was crazy. They had a whole legal strategy that was very smart. And so we see this as a struggle and a continuum of the struggle against Amazon. And when I talk to people in the US, there's a lot of, well, what could have the union done differently? We could have done many things differently. Would have we won? I don't know. The real question is, could you ever win an NLRB election at an Amazon fulfillment center? I don't know the answer to that. I think we can, but I think that the real question is, how do we take on Amazon as a labor movement? And I want to end with the idea that this is a continuum of the struggle of Amazon workers. When we talk internationally to labor unions in other countries, workers at Amazon in Italy went on strike in support of this campaign. In Germany went on strike in support of this campaign. In Australia went on strike the day of the ballots being counted. So the idea that even after this loss, that it is a negative impact is not how the international labor movement sees this. They see it as a huge stepping stone of the United States actually taking Amazon on in a real way. And the workers see it that way. So I'll leave it and I'll stop because I know I'm talking too much, but to end it with, the workers are fired up. They don't feel like, oh, it's so disappointing that we did this and didn't win. They're demanding a second election. The trial started today and will continue through next week, and you can hear from workers that are going to testify about this. They feel like their election was stolen. It's bad timing because Trump was saying that so much, so I hate to align with stolen elections, but that's really how they feel, right? So I'll end with that to say that the workers are fired up. We're continuing to build with them, with the committee. We're hoping to have a rerun election. We're going to do everything we can to take another swing at it, and are hopeful that this is hopefully going to spark a flame where Amazon workers stand up in whatever way they see is most applicable to their situation. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Adam. That's so exciting. And it's great to hear your optimism as well. I mean, on the first day, people thought, well, how do we feel about this? Was this a terrible defeat? Was it really a victory in disguise? But no, you've really set us straight and helped us think this through. And it's very encouraging. So thank you. So our next speaker is Craig Dixon. He recently retired after nearly 50 years as a member and leader of the Utility Workers Union of America, Local 1-2, moving from a shop steward to the union executive board to business agent, and still a trustee of the Dutchess County Central Labor Council. And Craig describes his colleagues on the council as the best people in the Hudson Valley, and it's wonderful to have you with us. During your long career, you've represented workers at Con Edison, North American Energy Services, and Entergy at Indian Point. But what you probably don't know is that Craig is also a magician. And had we known this earlier, we might have changed the structure of this, of this forum, but you'll be on with us again and you can practice those skills at another time. But Craig has traveled the world as a magician, as a performer, as a lecturer. And he rose even in that occupation to become the national president of the Society of American Magicians. And tells us that some of the struggles experienced by both magicians and workers are very similar. Craig, we'd like to hear about your years, many years as a union member and union organizer without the support of the legal protections that you might have gotten from the PRO Act. So we're waiting to hear from you. Thank you. Craig, unmute yourself. Unmute yourself.
There we go.
Okay.
I saw someone muted me. They keep doing that. I think they know I talk too much. But it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much. I'm not an expert on anything. I'm a warrior, and I've always been a soldier and a warrior in the labor movement from the minute I first had a job. My family background were all Local 3 union members, so I was raised in a union household. So it's in your blood, and that's why I say even now I'm retired. You don't stop. You don't stop. The fight goes on. When I read the PRO Act, I was excited about a lot of the things because we faced so many of the challenges that this would finally address. We were out on strike with Con Edison. I did 46 years with Con Ed back in 1983, and we were limited to 10 picketers on a picket line. They went and got injunctions, and all we could have, and nobody fought back really well. The courts were stacked against us, and we could only have 10 people on a picket line. And there were 20 cops and 10 picketers. It was great. So I was in, and that went for 9 weeks, and it was a disaster. So that was what inspired me. Actually, before that, I got involved as a shop steward. And we knew it's almost a grassroots fight where we have to do this locally, and we had to do it our way. And there were times when we even had to hire our own attorneys to fight the bigwigs at the company and push back. And solidarity was the big thing, And we had anytime there were new members, we trained them how important it was and what we did. And things went on. I got more involved in magic and sort of out of the labor movement for a while, and got sucked back in full force in 2012 when Con Edison thought fit to throw us out on the street and lock us out. And it was funny, up until that point, we always prayed when a contract was up that we would get a lockout, because in New York, you had to wait 7 weeks to get unemployment. But if you were locked out, you got it right away. Well, times were changing, and big corporations, and you've seen more of it, they're using the lockout as a tool. They thought, because of the climate, and now you had the me generation, they thought they were going to break the back of our union. And I had been a picket captain back in 1983. So I stepped up and said, I'll do it again at one of the largest workout centers in Westchester. And we fired these kids up. They had never faced a battle before. Me and one of the business agents, Scotty McNeil, had been. And we trained them, and it was trying to inspire them and let them understand what a fight was all about, because we had fought before, we've been tested, and we were in for this fight. And we were supposed to do one day a week, 8 hours. I was there 16 hours, 7 days a week. Once I started, and they were giving me unemployment, so it was gas money. So we organized them really well. We had roving pickets. That's why we talk about secondary. The PRO Act has things about secondary pickets and secondary strikes. What Con Edison did is they set up a back gate into the Eastview complex for contractors to come in and out, because of course they had an army of contractors on board. And we weren't allowed to picket them. We weren't allowed to block the gates. We weren't allowed to have any presence whatsoever. But being the chickens that management were, they couldn't face us crossing the picket line out front. Some of them started sneaking in the back gate. Well, that broke the agreement. And as soon as that happened, we organized and we set up pickets at the back gate. And they didn't like that. They tried to stop it, but they couldn't. They broke their own rules. So having with the PRO Act the ability for secondary pickets and boycotts, and be able to hit the contractors at their place of business and where they breathe and affect their business would be a big plus. There's so many things. I've been before the NLRB, arbitrators, and the NLRB, as the previous speaker said, it's pretty close to useless. The chief counsel there was, out of the Trump administration. We had black and white contract violation letter law, and all they did was give you a circle jerk, and you ran in circles over and over and over again. So what we did is, we would bluff them internally and go at them internally, and it would cost them one way or another. And eventually we would fight back, and they would give up because they weren't going to win. We have, huge, highly trained workforce, and if they're not working for you, you're not going to hire a contract to do what it took a lot of us 30 and 40 years to learn how to do. And when people start getting ticked off, they're not as productive as they used to be. They really aren't. You start making mistakes, and lights go out, and that's not a good thing. So having some teeth. I mean, even if you won a judgment at the NLRB, it would come down and, okay, big corporation, don't do that again. There were no fines, there were no repercussions, there was nothing. So, it was easy enough for them to just do it again. Just do it again. Changing those laws and giving the NLRB real purpose and teeth would be monumental. Monumental. Getting rid of the right to work too, and all that. Also, my wife worked for IBM, and I watched what went on there. They tried to organize. They had a small union force that was under CWA, but they never got anywhere. The workers there knew that if you joined that union, you had a target put on your back. Your ratings depended on it, and your raises and annual bonuses depended on it. And anybody that stood up with them got the lowest ratings, no raises, and when they had their what they call reorganizations, they were the next to be laid off. And they knew it, and so they couldn't get anybody. And they abused the H-1B visa program too. And I got to know, because I would go to their picnics. I got to know a lot of the people that came in on those visas, and they were terrified. They wouldn't stand up because they knew they wouldn't get it and be able to work here and make a good salary to support their families. And it was basically another version of just legalized slavery, and IBM knew how to play the game. My wife was fired once, almost fired again, but I became her shop steward, and we got her boss's boss fired. She outlasted her boss. They finally didn't know she was Norma Ray. And when I got the Labor Hero Award, I spoke about her. She was my Norma Ray, because she fought back with no backing, with nobody around her. And I taught her how to make them paranoid. I gave her some tricks on how to just really freak them out. Eventually, they gave her a 10% wage increase, the top rating, but said, we've eliminated your job. You're going to have to find another job in the company. But during her tenure, the engineers loved her because she came up with solutions and fixes. So they snatched her up in a heartbeat, and she outlasted everybody. But she was still discriminated against, where coworkers were making 67, 69,000. She was still down because of what they did to her all those years, down making 32,000 a year. And that's how they dealt with people. They just held you back and put a knee on your neck. I've faced so many union busting law firms. Entergy used them. NACE used them. It was always a challenge. We were in negotiation, the final contract for Entergy, for Indian Point. And they hire these outside, they do all their arbitrations too, this outside union busting law firm. And we had an Entergy attorney there, and this guy, and I won't give his name, but his name was Pat Collins. I'm not going to say that. But even when we had agreements on different segments of the contract for Entergy, we would have, in principle with the Entergy attorney, he would come back and, no, we don't agree to that, and circumvent it. And it got to the point where our president threw him out of the room. We had federal medias there. This guy didn't care. They just didn't care. His whole premise was not give up anything and say no to everything and shut it down. Recently, and so I talked to everybody. Recently, I was undergoing radiation therapy, and it doesn't stop. I wasn't thinking about that. I'm talking about contract negotiations with SEIU 1199. They were the radiation technicians that finally got organized and got the union, and they're going for their first contract. And I said to them, and it's probably been more than a year, hasn't it? And they went, yeah. And I said, and there's some real dirtbag lawyer that's stopping everything. And I said, yeah, he's from an outside. And I had to explain it because they didn't know who this guy was. They're hired to do that. And what they want to do is get to a point where everybody's so frustrated, they're going to say, well, this is our last best offer. That's it. But they have other areas to look at, and they had pension benefits and medical. This guy wants to give them nothing. I said, yeah, we're used to that. Surface bargaining. They're just going to push the same pile of crap at you as long as they're bargaining, and they'll say it's in good faith, which it's not. They're bargaining, so they haven't violated anything yet. They skirt the line. I said, but you've got to push back hard, and you've got to push back. And I said informational picketing. There's a lot of things. So I'm over there helping them with this. It doesn't stop. It doesn't stop. But the battle is now. This PRO Act would be game changing. I mean, we have to push so hard to get this through. We really need this. It would right so many of the wrongs that we've lived with for decades, for literally decades, the inequities. We got to get all the support behind it. I'll be out here until the last breath leaves my body, fighting for labor rights, union rights, worker rights, and civil rights, because I've done it since I got out of high school in 1969. I'm not about to stop now. I appreciate the opportunity to be here with all my family, because you all are my family. Love you all. Thank you for having me.
We love you too, Greg. Thank you so much. So our final panelist this evening is Juanita Sanchez. She's the Northeast Regional Field Coordinator for the AFL-CIO, and she's our regional champion for the PRO Act. Juanita began her labor career with SEIU Local 254-615, which is now 32BJ, in 2001. She worked on organizing campaigns such as Justice for Janitors and other service worker campaigns for 15 years with SEIU. In 2014, Juanita joined the National AFL-CIO as the Northeast Field Coordinator and has worked with various states in the Northeast District on mobilizing programs. She is dedicated to the education and mobilization of rank and file members. Juanita, you're also dedicated to getting the PRO Act passed for American workers. What do we need to know about the PRO Act and about the struggle to get it passed? And what should we be doing to take part in this campaign?
Well, thank you for letting me be here and talk about the PRO Act. And I think, everybody here before me that spoke really captured the spirit of what the PRO Act is meant to do, which is provide more strength to workers and a larger voice, either at a local level, state level, or at the national level when it comes to organizing and forming a union. We heard Brother Adam talk about and lift up, just the anti-union tactics and strategies that Amazon used, with the blatant understanding that nothing was going to happen to them. And if it did, they could afford it. And I think we have to think about the PRO Act not being passed for unions, but being passed for all workers, right? Because this will lift standards for all workers. This will take out so many obstacles that the National Labor Relations Act has basically eroded over the past 50 years. Adam, you put it very well, brother, when you said it's, the National Labor Relations Act is the employer's laws. It really is, because as it is right now, the employer has the right to fire strikers and replace them. The employer has the right to have these closed caption meetings on the shop, and then by the time the board gets to them, it's a year and a half later, and you've either settled the contract or have lost, and there's still pending issues. And so it is not the legislation it was once. It's a dog with no teeth and no bark, or no bite at this point. And then what we're trying to do is really create a path for all workers here to have the right to organize and form a union. And I always go back to the idea of, if there was any other way to beat poverty, I would join your team. But unions really are the only vestige left in our country to provide a path to middle class wages with benefits, not having to worry about having 2 or 3 jobs to make barely ends meet, right? You know, unions do raise the bar for all workers, not just labor and union members. And I think that that's what we need to be spreading, is that this bill is not about us. It is not about labor. It is not about, you know, the millions of workers that we already represent. They already have rights, you know, they already have collective bargaining agreements. This is about creating a path and getting rid of basically Jim Crow laws that, you know, cover our labor movement, like right to work. And so with that, the PRO Act really is about us being involved in talking to one another and what that means. And what that means is about creating standards in our communities, about how workers are going to have a free and honest voice at work, about what it takes to maintain a family, to be able to take your kids to, you know, a baseball game instead of having your neighbor take them because you have to go to your second job, right? You know, being able to go to the doctor, being able to go to, you know, on vacation. I mean, how many people do you know, either in the audience or here, have lost their job because they didn't have a voice in order to, you know, protect it, or have had stagnant wages over the past 10 years? I mean, how many people have lost their homes because there is no, you know, there's no way to getting, you know, into a better paying job? And so this is what the core of the PRO Act is, and that is lifting up workers. And that is also looking at campaigns like Amazon. Like you said, Adam, Amazon isn't about RWDSU, but it's about the labor movement and how we respond to it. And I think the major response right now is the PRO Act, because the PRO Act will strengthen quite a few laws that we have on the books, which is, you know, the right to form and join a union, real consequences for the employer for once. Right now, I don't know how many people have been a part of an organizing campaign, but when they break the rules, they put up a flyer that says, sorry, we weren't supposed to do that. But they put it on the bulletin board behind all the other stuff, like about 8 feet high, where the average height person like myself, which is about 5'4" on a good day, is not going to see it or read it, right? And so when employers are faced with no consequences, they act the way that they have been. And Amazon, or if you were a part of the Nissan fight in Mississippi, you know, they did the same things, right? You know, they held captive audience meetings. They had their own doctors on site, right? They had people with cars, but charging them every week. And so the employer embeds their employees into a culture of really depending and relying on them. And the PRO Act really questions that and provides real consequences to the employer for their actions, for breaking the law, for expediting people to have their first contract. I know many people here have been a part of a first contract fight. Sometimes after an election, it takes years to get a first contract. Years. Like, why should it take years? You won, you go to the table in good faith, you settle. There you go. But now, because, you know, as Brother Adam said, and I'm going to keep using this line, the NLRB is really the employer's playground at this point. So that's really what the PRO Act is doing. We all need to be involved because we all have skin in this game, because it's not about just union members. It's about every worker being able to have the opportunity to form and join a union willingly and openly, without consequences, without with more protections for them and not the employer. And also, I'd like to, you know, point out that in recent polls, we're seeing that 77% of Americans supported Amazon workers and their fight. the tides of how people see unions has changed. You know, for so many years, the idea of a union was Jimmy Hoffa, right? This big mobster guy. And I'm like, well, I don't know about Jimmy Hoffa, but my dress has lemurs on it. And I've been on plenty of strike lines and have, faced the boss many, many times. But I think people are starting to realize, and especially through the pandemic, is that there's been a lot of broken promises from the employer and also from the American dream. And I think that this is also a moment in time, like in the 1930s, like our brother Samir had mentioned, it's all coming together. And if we don't take this opportunity and we don't take this opportunity to educate each other about what the PRO Act does, it's really going to be a lost opportunity. And I just want to wrap up with saying is that you can always visit our website, aflcio.org. It has a ton of talking points about the PRO Act. There's also a PRO Act toolkit, which I don't know if I have a chance, if I'm allowed to put anything in the chat, but if I do, I will put that website in there. It has what we call common sense economics, which, helps us have conversations with one another about the PRO Act and its impact on us. And I think one of the most powerful pieces is that people get to share their story, union or not union, right? And how the PRO Act would impact them. And so I'll be adding that into the chat. If you are with an affiliated local and would like to do that training for your members or a community organization, I'm more than happy to work with Sandy from the Hudson Valley to, bring us together, because this fight isn't just about labor. It's about everybody in your community and having access to good jobs with good benefits and defined benefits, not always relying on open markets and capitalism to provide our retirement, which I still find crazy. And so I just want to say thank you so much for having me here. And thank you for being a part of this all-star team, because when everybody started talking, I was like, I don't really have anything to give besides what they already gave. So, but I hope that you do walk away with understanding that this is a fight for everybody, not just, union members, but everybody. That, we can win Amazon elections if the laws are here to protect us and not big corporations. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Juanita. What are the chances of getting the PRO Act passed in the Senate?
Well, I'm optimistic for once in my life, and I'm a bit of a pessimist. I think we have a great chance, because again, when you look at the polling, it doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or a Republican or an independent, you're feeling your pockets. And the answer is to be able to form and join a union without having the boss on your back and threatening your livelihood. And I think the pandemic has really provided this moment in time, which, I wish we never had a pandemic, put it that way. But with the pandemic, I think people have seen an onslaught of abuse towards, first responders, the crumbling infrastructure we have, be that our healthcare system, be that our roads. People have had a chance, because we have been locked at home, to take a breath and to really look around and take stock of, what really is the 1%. And we have no chance of ever being them, because the rules are rigged against us. So I'm very optimistic that we can do this if we fight together, not just union members, not just the rank and file, but our family members, that we're out there educating folks that this is not the union being big, bad, selfish, gangster dudes on a strike line, which still haven't seen that strike line yet. I've always been there with a cat dress on or my lemur dress. So, but this is really about everybody coming out, and the impact that it will have on women and people of color, of course, is going to be astronomical. As a woman, I know that I'm still making 75 cents. Sometimes it's better, depending on inflation, to the dollar, as a man is doing my job. And, I've experienced that in my career. So, and, when you think about that, and you think about your moms and your sisters and your aunts, you're like, well, they work hard. Why aren't they being paid the same? And I think this is our moment. And that's why I think the PRO Act has a heck of a good chance to pass in the Senate. And we're doing everything we can from labor's end. And we are asking our community partners, our families, our neighbors to join in this fight.
Okay, we're all on your team, Juanita. Thank you. Thank you so much. And now I'll turn it over to Beth Wilson, my union sister from UUP, who will moderate our discussion.
Okay, I want to thank all of our speakers. Oh my God, what a fabulous panel we've managed to assemble. We've outdone ourselves this month. That's a shout out to my friends on the education committee, because wow. Okay, and I want to mention, so if any of the attendees in the Zoom meeting would like to ask a question or something, you can indicate, put your question in the chat box, or indicate that a topic that you'd like to ask about as we continue our discussion with the panelists. So I'll be monitoring that as we continue. Okay. I just want to introduce the moderated section. This is my moment in these First Friday events where I get to kind of sound off a little bit before we continue the conversation a bit. And I am the United University Professions chapter president at SUNY New Paltz. So I'm a public sector worker. And the PRO Act, it may feel like it doesn't really necessarily affect public sector as much, but it will. And as I think our speakers have indicated, passing the PRO Act will help the entire labor movement. One of the provisions I understand in the PRO Act actually addresses the Janus decision that was made that would empower unions actually to collect dues from everyone within the bargaining unit. Which was something that we lost in the Janus decision, where we can now have free riders, where people can, get all the benefits of having the union negotiate the contract, but they can elect not to pay the dues. It's like, it's rather unfair, and it's obviously a union busting idea. It was pressed through the Supreme Court as a freedom of speech thing for Mark Janus, that it somehow curtailed his freedom of speech to make him have to pay union dues. But that wasn't the point. The point wasn't defending somebody's freedom of speech. The point of that court case was explicitly to bust public sector unions as much as possible. They wanted everybody to bail. And guess what? The good news is people haven't done that. People have not left the public sector unions in droves after Janus, because I think those of us who are, who have experienced being unionized understand how much that means, the value of that membership. Now, the PRO Act itself is going to be extending that right and enabling more people to unionize. And that's exactly the point. I want to thank Samir for his really brilliant summary of, what the union movement from the original Wagner Act through now. I can say from my own personal experience, I had the rather, sort of sad chance. It was my freshman year in college. The first election I got to vote in is when Reagan got elected. And I was dismayed. I literally put on a black armband and wore it for a week after that election, because I knew it was not anything that was going to be good. And we saw what has happened since then. So, I mean, I can say that in my lifetime now, I have the greatest hope I ever have for turning that stuff around. I have spent my entire adult life fighting, kicking against the pricks, trying to stop this nonsense. And with, the turn that we've now had recently between the rise of the BLM movement, with the rise of, the whole, Bessemer kind of fight with Amazon, I am more hopeful now than I think I ever have been, that we can actually turn this around and listen to working people and enable them to have some power within the system that we have. So anyway, so again, thanks to all of our speakers and thanks for the inspirations. And I mean, it's been a tough fight, as Brother Craig attested to. It's been a difficult fight, right? But I'm hopeful that we can maybe pass some of this stuff. Okay, so looking in the chat, we've got a couple of, so Naomi Allen has a question. One about PROACT and one about the Amazon Drive. I'm going to unmute Naomi and let her, wait, if I can find her. I have to look on the list here. Okay. Okay, so Naomi, would you please, yeah, unmute yourself. I've enabled you to speak.
Hi, thank you. And thank you for the for this event, because I think this is one of the best ones of your First Fridays that I've attended. It's very interesting to me. I'm a retired retiree of New York City Local 100 Transport Workers Union. So I know from my own experience in organizing struggles over fair contracts and other things that turnout is crucial. If you want to get the result that you want to get, a positive result, you need to inspire people, basically, to support you and to come out and vote, even though it's often often difficult for them to do that for various reasons. The turnout in Bessemer was very low, and nobody has referred to it, and I'm just wondering if we should just chalk it up to, you know, company intimidation, or the fact that they inflated the workforce at the last minute. Did the new people who were put on the rolls get an opportunity to vote too? That might have had a bad effect on the outcome of the vote. But what accounts for that very low turnout? And the other question is about the PRO Act. What can we do? Those of us who are active in the labor movement, those of us who are just boosters for the labor movement now, what can we do to help the PRO Act pass? Specifically, I mean, you know, it seems to be a little bit out of our hands at this point, and I'm wondering if there are any strategies that your speakers have that would help us push it forward. That's it.
Okay, thank you, Naomi. So Adam, would you like to go first, and then we can get to the larger question?
Sure. So I think that there's some, how do I say, reporters sometimes are wrong. And so how do I explain the turnout? So when you look at turnout for union elections and you take an aggregate of the past 2 years, and then you look at how much turnout there typically is in union elections, you are not there. You're comparing in-person elections to mail ballot elections and elections during the pandemic. And so they're very different numbers. And so standard union elections have higher turnout if you're voting in person, but mail ballot elections have significantly lower turnout. The mail ballot elections since the pandemic have increased significantly, but I don't know what the overall numbers are. I'm not a researcher in that sense, but I know that the mail ballot elections that I've run are significantly lower. Usually, in fact, in New York, before the pandemic was and when I say is before the pandemic had made most mail ballot elections become the standard, the turnout for mail ballot elections was around 25 to 30% in New York, according to the board agent when we were running elections here in New York, right? And so the average mail ballot election since the pandemic, I'm told, was about 71%. And so that's very, very different than a lot of what reporters have been saying, which is in the high 80s or 90% turnout. And so, yeah, so what that looks like is turnout was 55% versus 71%. So still fairly low comparing to the mail ballot election. I'd say that there's two things. One, the legal strategy Amazon used was they picked up the ballots from the mail ballot box 4 times. on 4 dates. They didn't challenge any of those ballots because those were the ballots that they coerced workers to vote into the ballot box on site for. And so what happened was the no vote was not very mobilized. It's not a mobilized no vote. In fact, most of the workers that voted no were younger workers that just got a job there. And Amazon told them it's just a condition of employment. Just vote no. Don't worry about it and just bring it to work. Bring it to a manager. They'll tell you where to put it, stuff like that. And so at the end of the day, the atmosphere in the fulfillment center is still pro-union. But workers, because they felt surveilled and they felt Amazon was watching every move they were doing, didn't feel like the turnout, they didn't feel that comfortable. And so that's part of the fear that Amazon would find out anything. And that's why Amazon did what they did. They're already known for surveillance. And then if they set up all these stages and they show we're bigger than the law, we are bigger than the NLRB. We do whatever we want. And so some things that they would say, for example, were you're going to have to strike if Amazon, if the union wins, right? So it's like, well, that's not true, but employers lie all the time. And then they'd say, oh no, we are never going to give you anything unless you go on strike. Yeah, we're not giving you enough, like deal with it. And so then it would be like, oh wait, what do you mean? Well, ask the union. If we are never going to bargain with you and give you anything at the table, unless you go on strike, ask the union what they do. You know, and so those were kind of some of the things. That's not legal, but whatever, right? Like they don't care. So anyway, I would say it's a very long-winded answer, but I would say that the turnout was low. It was lower than we expected, but it wasn't as low as some people are making it out to be, if that makes sense.
Okay, so the other question, maybe Juanita, can you help us with regarding what can we do right now to help pass this thing?
I think the biggest act that we can do right now to pass the PRO Act, you guys are in New York and a bit spoiled with your representation there. They're very PRO Act happy, but is, you know, to write to them, thanking them for their resolve, for standing with working people when sometimes it's the hardest decision to make, right? But also writing op-eds to, you know, your local newspapers, maybe joining different coalitions that work on labor issues to, you know, just kind of keep, you know, with, you know, keep up with the latest. There's also, you know, you can do stuff online. Like if you go to the PRO Act toolkit that I sent, there's digital images that you can use on your Facebook, you know, that are, you know, will give more visibility to the PRO Act. And just by talking to one another and saying like, hey, I joined this panel and they were talking about the PRO Act. And did you know that it's more than about union members? Or, you know, a lot of us have different kinds of conversations with our family and our friends. And it's just important to, you know, talk to them, hear them, listen to them, and make sure that they, you know, understand what's at stake for all workers, not just union members, and see how they want to be involved. Maybe you guys do different kind of letters to the editor, or maybe you find out that Sandy is hosting a PRO Act event and you're like, hey, I want to do that. So just, you know, keeping informed and just keeping an open mind and continue talking to one another.
Yeah, Cynthia is actually pointing out, and I was just thinking this, I seem to recall seeing an email or something, because I get so many messages now recently about targeting certain senators. Like I think it was Mark Kelly in Arizona, and there's like a couple of others. I wonder if we could mention those people in case people have family or friends in the states.
Oh,
represented by those senators, to encourage them to tell those senators to do the right thing.
Yeah, so if you have any brothers and sisters out there in Arizona, please have them reach out to Cinema and Mr. Kelly. They definitely are on the fence. And then also Warner in Virginia is also, you know, we've been engaging Warner, you know, on the ground a lot because we have not heard whether or, you know, not there's support there for the PRO Act. You know, through the hard work between all of our labor, you know, friends and family and, you know, supporters, we were able to flip Angus King and Joe Manchin. And so I don't know how I do represent West Virginia. Joe is interesting to say the least. And so, working with him, and getting him to that point really took, not just our labor allies, our members, but it took our labor allies, our community friends to really push this agenda with Joe and, let them know. But Capito from West Virginia, if you have some folk there, have them reach out to her. She is not PROACT friendly, but I think there is a way that we can, put some fire under her to make sure that she understands that this is what's best for West Virginia to move forward with jobs. Because a part of the PROACT is also part of the American Rescue Plan is going towards different industries and making sure that states who have been traditionally either coal-based or have had large manufacturing are ready for a new economy. And that has been one commitment that we've been able to make, and the United Mine Workers have been very comfortable with that commitment.
Okay, great. So there've been some other comments in the chat, and I know Juanita, in your discussion, you mentioned, something that essentially a lot of these anti-union, right to work stuff, it works out as Jim Crow laws, essentially. So I was wondering if any of our speakers would be interested in addressing the kind of racial dynamics of the PROACT and what it would signify, and how the labor movement has historically perhaps engaged the kind of inequities based on race that workers encounter all the time.
I can, I'll say this, and then Adam, I think you have the most, modern example with Amazon, so I'll hand it over to you immediately. But the PROACT would get rid of right to work. It would erase right to work. Now, mind you, I'm sure we're going to see lots of legal battles coming out of the South on that one. But, right to work laws were created to create a division between white workers and African American workers in a very deep-seated, racist culture at the time, and those ripple effects continue today. We now call them a dog whistle politics. We call it microaggressions. We've just got fancier words for what the laws are really intended to do, and that is to keep us separate and not equal. And so, with that being said, the PROACT would abolish right to work and abolish those laws that have deep roots in the Southern culture and that are trying to creep up here as well, in above the Mason-Dixon line. We have been, knock on wood, very successful in beating back right to work in the North. But we've seen losses like Wisconsin. We have a fight right now in New Hampshire. And this, instead of having fight by fight by fight with people who have, an unlimited pocket of resources, the Koch brothers, and all of their offshoots, this would deal with it once and for all. And then I think, Adam, you can, not saying you can, but handing it over to you, because definitely your experience is very fresh with right to work.
Yeah, thanks, Juanita. I think what I'd say is this, kind of taking a macro look, like, why does Amazon build in Bessemer? Why does Amazon build in the Fairfields in Detroit, which they're looking at now? Why do they build in Baltimore? Why? So like, they put these fulfillment centers, and actually, interestingly enough, on major old U.S. manufacturing sites. Bessemer used to be U.S. Steel. In Pittsburgh, it used to be Bethlehem Steel. In Detroit, right, it used to be the manufacturing. Everywhere they build are jobs that have been lost due to globalization, right? And so what you look at, that's a simplification, but either way, what you look at for Amazon is that they build on a place where there is access to what they perceive as cheap labor, because there's nothing else and there's no more jobs. And why are there no more jobs? and what communities are going to be looking to work at Amazon because it's the best thing that they have available to them in the area of Bessemer. And it's all fueled by racism, right? Everything about it. The managers in Bessemer were white. The plant manager was white. The majority of the workers were Black. The place is policed. Which workers are going to be more fearful of the police walking around? This is what the reality is, right? And so when you look at all of these factors, there's a reason they built at Bessemer. It's right to work. There's a reason they are situating their fulfillment centers strategically, both near access to communities that they think they can take advantage of. I'd say that the miscalculation to a degree in Bessemer is the deep-rooted civil rights and history of fighting back. And then most recently, the history of Black Lives Matter in Birmingham and fighting back in Bessemer. And so this spirit of unionism and civil rights unionism in general that have histories in Bessemer and Birmingham is the reason you see that the workers are able to put up the biggest fight against Amazon in the US. I mean, that is a very real reality. And what carried the campaign was the connections of family members that supported you, et cetera, unions, et cetera. But to that point, it's right to work. That's what we're dealing with here is the right to work, the crushing of unions, the inability to have stable institutional unions that can actually fight back in the same way in certain states. And so what you do see is you see the race dynamic that right to work has created, and you see how Amazon strategically plans to build in places where they can take advantage not only of right to work, but of communities they don't think highly of. And it's racist, it's classist, and it feeds into everything that's wrong with a lot of how U.S. capitalism and globalization has affected the labor market in this country. And I guess I'll just leave it there.
Okay. I'm wondering if maybe Samir, if you have a few words. I mean, I know coming up in the actual origins of a lot of Jim Crow came out of the fact that in the late 19th century, there was this movement, a rise in organizing of unions that was threatening to conjoin white working class and Black working class people. And so, Jim Crow seemed essential to try and squash that development with at least one of the kind of proximate factors in why those laws were made. But you probably know a lot more about it than I do.
Well, no, I think that's a great. I mean, that's a really important point to raise. I think we should say when I think it's important to just be clear about what we mean when we talk about what race is, right? Race has no biological reality, right? Like there's nothing inherent about it. What race is something that was designed ideologically by people with power to divide labor, right? That's the history of race. The history of race is the history of a division of labor that enables intensified exploitation among certain groups that are easily classified by the color of their skin, which has nothing to do with anything biological, right? That is what race is. That's how it's always, that's how it historically developed. And certainly, in the aftermath of the abolition of slavery, there is a concern among the white planter class, right? The class that had accumulated wealth off the enslavement of slaves, people who were enslaved from Africa, and they had to figure out a way, right? How are we going to continue making money now that we don't own people? Well, we got to find a new way to divide poor whites in the South and formerly enslaved people who, in fits and starts and never in perfect ways, never universally, but in profound ways, started to organize together because they realized, look, like we're getting screwed by the same people, right? If you're a poor white farmer in the South, in Alabama, in Mississippi in 1880, or you're a formerly enslaved person or the kid of a formerly enslaved person who's a sharecropper or a tenant farmer, you start to think about it. You realize, well, like who are we harvesting these crops for? The same person. And organizing efforts start, and they're complex, they're fraught, there's full of contradiction in various ways, but they're also sometimes enormously inspiring and enormously threatening to the white ruling class. And it's impossible to really understand the history of Jim Crow, right? Because Jim Crow laws don't start right the moment the Civil War ends, right? There's a period after the Civil War of interracial political struggle through Reconstruction and through the populist movement in the South that starts to really rattle the foundations of the Southern aristocracy. And they got to come back. And so it's not until the 1890s and around 1900, right? We're talking like 25 years after abolition that Jim Crow laws are implemented as a means of dividing the white working class from the black working class. That then has its a long history, right? Of course. But to kind of fast forward, I think it's also important to remember, and the legacy of that obviously remains with us in various ways, but the labor movement was the history of the civil rights movement, and Adam sort of mentioned this by referring to civil rights unionism in Birmingham, where the steel workers were a very powerful force and a force for diversifying the steel industry in a way that the industry never really wanted to. The industry always wanted to keep black workers confined to the worst jobs in the open hearth, the hottest, most toxic jobs. And the union was the force that enabled, more desirable job classifications to be opened up. And that spreads across the country. And the civil rights movement always, from the get-go, was wound up with the labor movement. Now, not all fractions of the labor movement, and we often think, when you talk about labor today in public, most people think you mean like a white guy with a hard hat. They don't realize that, of course, today the majority of union members are women, increasingly women of color, and historically, black workers played a central role in building the CIO, building, and democratizing AFL unions. And so, I guess the last thing I'll say on this is the March on Washington in 1963, where Martin Luther King gives his famous speech, that was called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. It was organized by unions. The keynote speaker that day was not Martin Luther King. He was not supposed to be sort of he was a very charismatic guy by that point, obviously. But the icon of the organizer was A. Philip Randolph, a union leader, a black trade union leader who had spent decades in the labor movement, fusing labor organizing and civil rights organizing, and all along. I mean, there's so much. There's a ton to be said about this, and there's a lot of history to the links between those two movements. But coming to today, bottom line is, unions have been the principal force for economic mobility for black workers and workers of color always. The pay gap between women and men still exists. The pay gap between black workers and workers of color and white workers still exists. But where it shrinks, where it disappears, is where you have a union. And so what is how do we advance the struggle for racial justice in a serious way? We build a working class movement that can eliminate the barriers that the ruling class is always trying to impose between us, and a labor movement is the way to do that. And the PRO Act is a civil rights act, and it needs to be understood as such.
Okay, thank you, Samir. I did want to point out a little bit earlier in the chat, Nick Moran had posted a link for phone banking that the DSA, I believe, is running in relation to trying to get the PRO Act passed. Except he's gone now. So what I do want to just reiterate that you should have a look at the chat for this link to the DSA phone banking. Sparrow, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I have a question. It reminds me of Bacon's Rebellion too, right? The poor farmers and the free blacks, they've got together, and then all of a sudden you have the black codes, anytime that we start to mobilize. But I'm fascinated with language, and I think what do we do as a movement? I think the other side appeals to our selfless nature, whereas unions appeal to collectively working together. Was it like do it without dues or right to work? How do we combat these kind of slogans? With slogans of like solidarity that maybe appeal to our better nature instead of like our selfish nature. Anybody would like to answer that?
Any of the panelists?
I'll tell you what it isn't is right to work for less, because that has not caught on too well.
You tried that one, huh? I mean, one of the dimensions of this that was really interesting in comments by a number of the speakers that I kind of jotted down some notes here was the level of which it's really psychological warfare that goes on. Because I know one of the primary things that organizers have to do as you're going out to talk to people, in any kind of a fight, whether it's trying to get them to vote for the union in the first place, or to, kind of develop support for a potential strike, or to organize an action around anything in the workplace. One of the key things that an organizer has to do is inoculate the member, right, or the potential member. That inoculation, it's like, getting the vaccine, but it's about anticipating the nonsense that is going to come from the employer and telling the worker ahead of time, we know they are going to say this stupid thing. So then when they hear it from the employer, they'll say, oh, wait, they said they were going to say this, right? To try and kind of undercut the power, the strength of that message. I don't know, Adam, as somebody, directly involved with this organizing, if you want to speak a little bit more to this kind of psychological warfare dimension, and then we're going to be wrapping up because we're getting close to the end of time here.
Yeah, I mean, in my experience in organizing, I'd say that the biggest part of being an organizer is training workers on what the boss will say, and how do you frame it, and preparing them, right, but the need to prepare enough workers to be the foot soldiers to prepare their coworkers, so that what you don't get is a small amount of agitated, very well trained workers that have not disseminated that to the mass of workers, right? And so that also helps move workers further to what you could call the left, or just more union supportive. And then there's a lot of the main population of workers that don't get there. So it's like, we have trainings where we inoculate workers, and we try to do it as, we have 4 to 8 hour trainings, or the 30 minutes, or the 5 minute, or how do we just inoculate as much as possible. And so that's the main crux of being a union organizer, I would say, is really figuring that piece out. Now, when employers do things that are the surprises, like the mailbox or things like that, it becomes more challenging. What I always like to say, and what we said in Bessemer and everywhere, is expect the unexpected. They're going to do a thing we don't prepare you for. But the point is that, we can't prepare you for everything, right? So that's the part of the training itself. And then I'd also say, there are things like you can't prepare. We had one campaign we were running, a union buster pull a knife out as a threat. We had, union busters take workers into rooms that are pitch black and dark, and they turn on a little light, and then they, you sit for an hour with a union buster in a meeting. There's all these things that happen you can't prepare for, but what you can prepare for is the unexpected. You could have fun with union busting. I like to tell this story, and then I'll stop because I could go on forever about anti-union stuff. But in a Guitar Center campaign we had in Chicago years back, the workers found a clever way to talk about union dues. They printed out a bunch of headshots, and no offense to any union leaders out there, but headshots of union presidents. And they were calling them union hairdos. So they did this whole skit with the union buster who was like, you're going to have to pay union dues. He said this whole thing like, union dues, they're terrible. I don't want those. And it's like, yeah, I know. Isn't it crazy? And they did this whole skit around it. And then, the union buster's like, yeah, I mean, and they're expensive, and it's like, who would pay that much for a union due? It's crazy. And it ended up this whole thing. They started like, yeah, look at this guy. And then you make the union buster look like a fool. So there's some fun you can have with it. And I know that even like you mentioned Samir Jane McAlevey, she talks about some fun things too that workers have done, like the bingo and stuff like that. But you have to try to have fun with it, because otherwise it's psychological warfare. And it's like, how can you break it down so that it's not this like painful experience? Because the biggest thing that a worker will say, even if they're pro-union, they might just say at the end of the day, it's like, honestly, I just want all this to go away. Like, I want the union. I want to improve my work life. But like, I just don't want to have to go in that meeting and sit down with that manager again. It's like, so anyway, I'll end it there, but thanks for uplifting that. It's really, it's a challenging part of the work, but something we have to all tackle.
And, honestly, I think the psychology works the other way too. If you play, again, with the do thing that you mentioned, or I learned once at a labor notes workshop, that there was somebody in the room that said, like management was screwing around and not sitting down with us. And then they heard that we had ordered the porta potties. And all of a sudden they got serious because they realized they were actually going to have a strike on their hands, right? All that took was news that they had actually placed the order for the porta potties, and it turned it, right? The power of workers organizing together. Okay, Juanita, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to say this really quickly. I think, to Sparrow's comments, is that as labor staff and leaders, I think one of the worst things that we ever did in a historical concept is we quit talking to our members about hard issues. We quit talking to our members in general for whatever reason, and I'm sure there's plenty of reasons I could give off the top of my head. But I think we have to go back to the basics with our members, and that is being a part of their social consciousness, right? Before we had union halls, right? A lot of unions don't have those anymore, but they do have ongoing conversations, not just with workers are trying to organize, but also with their members. And, coming out of SEIU, those were hard conversations. Why are we investing so much money into organizing that company over there when we've got our problems over here? And we would have to do the education about market shares, about building owners. This is stuff that nobody had talked to them about before, because up until about mid 80s, everybody worked directly for a building owner, right? And so I think, it's a little bit of reflection on our part, not to walk away from our members when they ask us hard questions. And to remember that at the end of the day, I work for them, right? Keeping that in mind is that, when we talk to them about dues, I have to respect the fact that their hard-earned money goes to paying my salary and my benefits, right? And, that falls, I've had, members say, you don't make enough money. Why do you have holes in your jeans? And I'm like, well, I'm 25, right? So, and we also have other members who will scream oh, you guys are fat cats, right? And it's a spectrum, but they hug you at the end of a meeting because you've created a culture with them over years of being honest with them and not, sweeping it under the rug why things are the way they are. So I think we have to get back to some real basics with our members, because for too long we quit talking to them.
And I mean, that kind of brings us full circle back to Samir's original point when he first started this panel, talking about the fact we need the PRO Act to help level the structural playing field, but we absolutely need to just continue organizing and be really serious about doing our ongoing work. I guess the point of the PRO Act is trying to, the playing field is so unlevel at this point. It's, it's a mountain that we're climbing. To kind of bring it a little bit more level, it won't entirely do the job, but it will go far in enabling us to be able to do the organizing work that we absolutely all need to be engaging in moving forward. Okay, I guess we're over time officially, but I was asked to give, is Michelangelo still with us? Or we lost, yeah, is he here? Oh, yes, yeah, I'm gonna.
Hello.
Yeah, so to give a shout out for the DSA phone banking.
Yeah, absolutely. So put the link in the chat. I can drop it again. But we are doing a number of phone banks. This is being organized by the national organization. We're here today supporting this event as the Mid-Hudson Valley DSA, which is our local. And yeah, we're very excited to be in this fight with you all. This is a transformative campaign, and we believe very strongly in the need to build long-term relationships with labor for all the work that we do. And we feel this is a great way to kind of start building that and really getting things started. So super, super happy to be here. This was an incredible, absolutely incredible presentation tonight. So thank you all so much for the work you're doing, and we look forward to being a partner.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I guess I would just like to thank everyone that's participated in this, all the attendees, our wonderful panelists. What a terrific discussion. This has been really rich. Thank you, thank you, thank you on behalf of the Education Committee. And with that, I am going to, if I can get it started, go to our outro.
I realized when I was here a couple.
Oops, something happened there. Oh, I'm having an issue with my